honest, at the point of January to April, what you had was buyers making bids out of either fear or frustration. And what that was you would go into an offer with 10, 15, 20 bids, and people would look at it and say, if I go 10, 50, $100,000 over ask, I will win the bid, and it'll only take a couple weeks for me to regain all the money that I've overbid because the market continues to go up. So
it's
we've
like
seen
gambling,
it
right?
Exactly, and you.
So according to a number from the Ontario Ministry of Finance, the number has really dropped.
Yep.
And then, do you think this is a good thing or bad thing for Toronto?
That's a difficult question. It's a sensitive question. And I think if you look at the number in itself, it's not necessarily as it seems, because using York Region as an example, in April it was about 9.1% of transactions had at least one foreign investor involved on one side of the transaction, and I think that now we're down to 6.7. So there's certainly been a drop, but you have to look at that stat with a grain of salt because it doesn't separate buyers from sellers. So are people exiting the market? Are people still just as active as they were before? We're going to have to monitor that number going forward.
你而家收睇嘅係加拿大財經一號電視台。
嘉國地產發展趨勢，近期樓市最新動態。地產行業權威發布，眾多專家分析點評，盡在置業家國。
Hello everyone. Toronto Real Estate Board had released the August stats, and it shows the GTA market continued to cool off last month. So for those people who are wondering how's the market doing by the end of the summer and curious where it's going for the next quarter of this year, please continue to watch today's Real Estate Canada. Hello, Ken.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Not too
Thanks
bad.
for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before we jump into today's topic, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Well, my name's Cam Woolfrey, and I'm a sales representative for Royal LePage Signature, operating primarily out of the downtown core in Toronto. A bit of education background. I did a 4-year undergraduate degree at the University of Guelph, and if I could plug that program for a second, it's coming up on its 25th year of being in operation. So if you know of anybody who's looking to learn more about real estate, do a real estate degree, University of Guelph is top-notch. So other than that, I've been working in the commercial field and now switched over to Royal LePage for the last couple of years now, so specializing in residential sales.
Good. Now we know something about you, then let's jump back to the topic. So today we're going to briefly talking about the market in August. So how's the market doing in August or early September?
Well, we could talk about individual stats. We'll go back to August because those are the latest ones that are out. I think the number one headline that you see is number of sales are way down. And we're talking about a jump from almost 9,700 sales to 6,300 sales. I think it's important to provide some context about this because if you look back to 2015 and 2014, there were just under 8,000 and 7,500 sales. So even though the market has cooled in terms of number of transactions, it's still not as bad as the headlines would make you think. So when we're also talking about the number of transactions, you want to talk about average sale price. An average sale price in the GTA is around $729,000, which is up 2.9% year over year. But again, to provide context about that number, you have to look at the full picture, and we have to separate different asset classes to see how everything was affected. Because if you look at detached housing, it actually remained relatively flat. I think it was around 968,000 from 965 last year. But if you look at semi-detached housing, it was actually up 12.1% year over year, and condos were up 20.1%. So in terms of the market cooling, we can see that the detached market was actually the one that was affected the most. Another stat that realtors love using is days on market, and we're right around 28 days on market on average. If you look back to peak market in April, we were looking at about 14, 15 days, which could have been much lower if it wasn't of the introduction of bid processes into the system. But this shows that people are taking a little bit more time. There's more inventory, so there's more to check out, and it's becoming a little bit more of a rational market. But my favorite stat is actually that we're working with 2.58 months of inventory right now. And for those of you who don't know what months of inventory are, it would mean if everyone were to stop listing properties today, it would take 2.58 months to sell all of the inventory in the GTA. So it's worth noting that in a balanced market, 4 to 6 months of inventory is what you're looking at. So even though it doesn't seem like it, we're still technically in a seller's market right now.
According to what you just gave us, a lot of our audience has been noticed that downtown Toronto has not been hit that hard than, like, say, other GTA cities, say Markham or Richmond Hill or even Aurora.
Right.
Those cities has been like going up for the past few months, and then it's like crazy numbers.
Right.
But why is that happen? Why downtown Toronto is like stay stronger?
Well, I think, and we talk about proximity to the core in real estate. Obviously, location, location, location. And downtown Toronto has a lot of investment potential going forward. You look at these major infrastructure improvements, the Eglinton LRT, the possible expansion of the subway, and major projects like the Lower Don Lands and the East Harbour development. People do understand the long-term potential for investment in those areas. So there are some areas that are affected differently. And I mean, for real estate, you take a look at the big picture, and then you look at individual areas. And because I work in the core, I can talk about Leslieville being an area where there's still a lot of bid dates happening. And it has been affected, but just not as much as the rest of the market.
You're saying that for downtown Toronto, a lot of investors or house buyers, they are looking at the long term, unless other people who want to just flip the house and then just get the quick money.
Definitely,
right?
Definitely.
For this year's Toronto, after a scorching spring, the summer has really got hit by the new policy or other reasons, and then the sales is definitely down, and then a lot of buyers and investors are paranoid about this whole market. So can you elaborate, what do you think the main reason behind this market correction?
Well, I'll give you one main reason, but I'll talk about 3 points that bring on the one reason.
Okay.
So I'll take you back to April and the introduction of the Fair Housing Plan, which had 2 points in it that were, there's 16 points, but 2 main points in the foreign investment tax, the 15% tax, and then rent control. This changed buyer mentality a little bit, because up until that point, everyone thought the sky was the limit. And what happened was people started getting a little bit concerned. So you saw a bit of a pullback at that point.
Right.
Then about a week later after that, if you remember Home Capital, that was a company that went from about a $2 billion company to a $350 million valuation overnight. And people started remembering 2008 again and started having concerns about Canada's lending practices. Although we know now they weren't necessarily warranted, people started to pull back again and get concerned about what was going to happen going forward. And the third reason was interest rates. We've seen a couple bumps since that point, which normally causes downward pressure on prices. So all of that together, and I've kind of mentioned it, is changed buyer mentality. Because at the point of January to April, what you had was buyers making bids out of either fear or frustration. And what that was you would go into an offer with 10, 15, 20 bids, and people would look at it and say, if I go $10, $50, $100,000 over ask, I will win the bid, and it'll only take a couple weeks for me to regain all the money that I've overbid because the market continues to go up. So
it's
we've
like
seen
gambling, right?
Exactly, and you don't want to look at real estate as a short-term investment. It's very speculative when you do that, and we saw a very cyclical action, which kind of kept hurting itself over and over as people continued to bid just so they would be able to get a property.
You just said one of the reasons behind this whole market correction period is the foreign buyers is part of the reason, right?
Yep.
So according to a number from the Ontario Ministry of Finance, the number has really dropped.
Yep.
And then, do you think this is a good thing or bad thing for Toronto?
That's a difficult question. It's a sensitive question. And I think if you look at the number in itself, it's not necessarily as it seems, because using York Region as an example, in April it was about 9.1% of transactions had at least one foreign investor involved on one side of the transaction, and I think that now we're down to 6.7. So there's certainly been a drop, but you have to look at that stat with a grain of salt because it doesn't separate buyers from sellers. So are people exiting the market? Are people still just as active as they were before? We're going to have to monitor that number going forward. But as to whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, there's two sides to it, and I'll start with the one in which a lot of developers and prominent real estate minds in Toronto were talking about this back in February, whereas if you were going to taper or have the foreign investment tax, it would dissuade a lot of people from investing in pre-construction projects. And I know Brad Lamb had gone on record saying that specifically. So we may see that going forward. And then if you look at the way the government looked at it with the 15% tax, it was to try and get rid of the speculative investing from the foreign investment side. Because if you put that 15% tax on, immediately it no longer makes sense to make a speculative investment. So I would say it's good in the short term in terms of balancing the market, but it may have consequences long term as we go forward in terms of the supply and demand battle, which is always going to be an issue in Toronto.
For yourself, do you have a lot of foreign buyers, or?
I have a couple, and right now the ones who still have a long-term mentality are still interested in Toronto. I mean, you have a city that across the board is looked at generally as a solid investment for the next 10 years in terms of population growth, in terms of just generally being a safe place to live and a
That's important.
It's important, especially now. But we're seeing that long term, there's still interest for sure.
We got some agents coming to the studio to talk about that if the market didn't pick up for the next few months, and then for the next year it's gonna get worse. So do you believe this, or how do you see this next 6 months of the real estate?
You know what? I'm a real estate agent, so my answer is going to have a certain amount of bias to it. And obviously, if I pull out my crystal ball, I'd tell you exactly where the market's going to go. But I will say this, that the numbers for September aren't out yet, and they will, from a headline perspective, look similar to August, I believe. But we are seeing an uptick in number of in inventory and also in buyer activity, which is typical to see in a fall market. But what I do see is if everything stands as it is right now, you're going to see a return to a more stable market, which is in the long run a really good thing. But the X factor is going to be interest rates. I know that there have been talks about a couple more interest rate bumps, one more maybe at the end of this year and then a couple more next year. So
I just read the news that I think the city of the Bank of Canada gonna drop the last chance to bump the rates. Maybe that's one of the reasons that they don't want the market to keep going down, right?
Exactly, and that's why I say it's the X factor, and we're going to have to continue to monitor interest rates going forward. But if everything stands as solid right now, I think you're going to see a more rational real estate market going forward.
Thank you so much, Ken, for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks for watching.